presented by Tim Petrella. Tim is the Executive Vice President of Client Success at Marketing Evolution. In that role, Tim supports the client project teams and helps oversee Marketing Evolution's client engagements. In the 6 years that Tim has been at Marketing Evolution, he has helped measure and optimize over 275 marketing campaigns. Prior to joining Marketing Evolution, Tim served as an associate at the Boston Consulting Group. Tim graduated with honors from Princeton University. With that, I'm turning it over to Tim, who's going to get the meeting started.
Thanks so much, Alicia, and thank you everyone for taking the time this afternoon or morning to join today's webinar. So in just a moment, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, terrific. We can go ahead and get started. So as Alicia said, my name is Tim Petrella. I lead the Client Success team at Marketing Evolution. Taking a quick look at some of the attendees on today's call, it looks like I have met a handful of you, but there are also a lot of new names on the list, so thank you for taking the time to join us today. Today's topic for the webinar is 6 tips to increase TV ROI by building for in-campaign optimization flexibility, which is a little bit of a mouthful. And so maybe we can start by describing a little bit in maybe more plain terms what we're trying to accomplish today. The first thing that is really near and dear to many of us Marketing Evolution is this understanding and belief that in today's marketing environment, in today's marketing analytics environment, it's really marketing process improvements that are just as important as building a best-in-class marketing analytics system. And in order to really improve marketing ROI, it's almost impossible to have one without the other. The second goal for today is to walk through those 6 tips that I just described earlier. So what are 6 things that you can work with your teams on, that you can pass along to your partners, your agencies, and say, are we doing these things? And walk through why are those things so important to actually be able to positively impact ROI. So I want to start off with really what I consider a foundational point, and that is in today's marketing environment, it is too late to check your food after it's cooked. One phrase that I know a lot of people who've grown up watching infomercials have heard in the past is this idea of set it and forget it. Set it and forget it marketing really should be a thing of the past. And the reason is that marketers have the ability, the capability, the resources to be able to understand how things are working while they happen. I know there are a handful of Marketing Evolution clients on the phone. Marketing Evolution clients are learning about their early campaign results within 2 or 3 weeks after the campaign launches to be able to make those mid-course corrections. So in today's webinar, we won't spend as much time talking about how we do that, and I can refer you to some previous webinars to go through that topic. Today's discussion is really to understand how you can take the information you have learned and act on it by improving some of your marketing processes. Before we get too deep into that topic, I do want to just pull back a little bit and talk about kind of a fundamental tenet that Marketing Evolution believes, and that is in this idea of agile marketing, and that's a term that's been kind of thrown around increasingly by the marketing media. So I want to describe what it means for Marketing Evolution. For Marketing Evolution, agile marketing is this idea of real-time marketing and one-to-one marketing, and there's really 4 base tenets of agile marketing. And the first is that it's customer-focused. I think in the not-too-recent past, there's been this kind of conversation around how media is generating sales. One of the things that we want to remind our clients is that it's not media that generates sales, it's individuals, it's customers. And we want to put them at the center of any type of ecosystem and any type of marketing process. The second belief is that you need to be connected across every touch point and every outcome. There are just increasing ways for marketers to engage with your brands, different messages that are being delivered, and in order to really understand what is actually influencing your customers in positive ways, we want to be connected across those touch points. The third tenet of agile marketing for marketing evolution is this idea of in-market. The idea that we want to give marketers a better chance to get it right while it's happening and not just looking backwards after the fact. And the final piece, and this will be an important part of today's discussion as well, is this idea of predictive. The marketing landscape changes every day. What was kind of considered the standard last year is no longer the standard. So any marketing ecosystem needs to be able to look forward just as well as it can look backward. But really the focus for today is going to be on this idea of the in-market piece. So how do we give marketers a better chance to get it right while it's happening? So this is a chart that I'm sure is familiar to most of the people on the phone. This is the 2014 total media ad spending share by media. And what, of course, you'll right away notice is that even in today, as we're moving more to a digital-focused marketing environment, television really makes up the bulk of most marketer spend. The other thing that I think is really important to note in the context of this conversation is that idea of agile marketing that I was just describing is really being unevenly applied. As a matter of fact, it's really, for most of the clients that we begin working with, the idea of agile marketing is really only being applied to digital, and even then only to a subsection of digital. And for some of the marketers are kind of pushing the envelope in terms of the ability to react in real time. Maybe some of them are expanding that into mobile. The purpose of today's conversation is to be able to show you how we can actually take that 39% of marketing, the television bucket, and treat that just like we would treat digital or mobile by the ability to make real-time course corrections. And so the idea is, how do we take this, essentially what's been a lock, and you can see here an antiquated lock, and how do we remove that and include that television bucket as part of our real-time marketing budget? So historically, there's really been two reasons traditionally why television has been kind of considered off the table for that real-time optimization. Traditionally, I think the biggest reason was that analytics haven't been able to keep up. So most people would recall that traditional marketing mix models that have been around for the past 20 or 30 years are typically backwards looking. They're typically updated infrequently. Kind of best in class for marketers is the idea of updating that maybe twice a year or quarterly, but given the lag with updating data, it can be really difficult to have any idea of how your campaign is performing while it's still happening. To solve for that, and it's something that our firm has focused quite a bit on over the last decade, is this idea of cross-media attribution. And again, today we won't go into the specifics of how we do that attribution. I'd be happy to point people to other resources there. It's really what do we do with that information. The second piece, which I mentioned earlier, is there's this set of data connections that needs to happen in order for any analysis to be conducted. Traditionally, those pieces of data have existed in silos, and it's been very difficult for marketers to get that information quickly enough to be able to make sense of any of the data. And as I think everyone is familiar with, technology is really resolving that as an issue. One of the core tenets of any of our marketing work is the idea that we're going to bring all that data together into one system so that it can pass kind of fluidly back and forth. And so really within the last 2 or 3 years, this idea that analytics can't keep up kind of is no longer true. The bigger issue today is that the actual processes have become inflexible. When I talk about processes, the processes I mean are really the marketing ecosystem that exists between marketers, media owners, and media agencies. And there's a very good reason for that. Previously, there had been no need for greater flexibility. As I just described, there wasn't that in-campaign information to be able to tell marketers what's working and what's not. And so the kind of typical process won out, which was an annual planning and buying cycle, typically a very slow turn approval process. I think for most marketers that annual approval process lasts between 2 and 3, sometimes even 6 months, and also very restrictive contracts. And so today what we want to talk about are what are some really easy, small changes that marketers, media owners, and agencies can make to actually, again, eliminate this as being the barrier and to be able to begin to make some of those real-time marketing decisions based on what they're learning about television. So what Marketing Evolution has done over really the past 6 months is conduct a series of interviews. Our executive leadership team has met with media experts across the media owners, across advertisers, across agencies, and posed them really the very straightforward question is, if marketers wanted to enhance their TV flexibility, if they wanted to be able to act on the information that they're receiving, what are the things they can do? And the really important caveat that kind of was the thread through all of those conversations was that it needs to work for everyone in the ecosystem. It needs to work for the marketers, it needs to work for the media owners, and it needs to work for everyone's agency partners. Having those conversations, we've really come up with kind of 6 core kind of checklist items that marketers can implement today over the next couple of weeks that will give them that flexibility. So the first one, and a very common kind of thread complaint that we heard from marketers, is that there's this idea of the upfront buy makes it really restrictive to make changes to their campaign. So one of the questions that we asked is, what are the kind of standard flexibility terms that marketers have been able to achieve? So one thing that we'll recommend is kind of a best practice set of contract terms that you can include in your upfront television buys. This next idea is how you get more flexibility to move across different day parts, across different audiences. And there's a really significant opportunity by not locking into restrictive bargain CPMs. So if marketers are able to take a kind of tiered CPM approach, it'll give them opportunity to have more flexibility to move across day parts, across targets. One of the kind of easiest opportunities, really the low-hanging fruit, is for marketers to develop the internal capability to change creative allocation very quickly. For most campaigns, this will be a costless improvement to dramatically improve marketing ROI. So we want to talk a little bit about what that creative process is and how marketers can become more efficient. Fourth is this idea of withholding budget. So I think every marketer is familiar with the scenario of either getting budgets throughout the year that they weren't expecting, or even kind of giving it away. One of the things that we really want to focus on when we're working with our clients is, how can you take some money that maybe you would have typically planned at the beginning of the year, hold it to the side, and use things like scatter market buys to actually improve your marketing ROI, because you can put those 15 or 20% of dollars into the media that you know will drive your highest ROI. Fifth is a very big question for every marketer should consider, which is local TV worth the premium for them? Local TV has a lot of kind of incremental flexibility benefits that you aren't able to achieve with national TV, but it also comes at a cost premium. So we want to talk about, one, is it worth it to actually invest in local TV, and what should that investment look like? And finally, and I will call this the golden rule of improving TV flexibility, is this idea of establishing a real-time operating rhythm. I think anyone on this phone would agree that in the heat of end of quarter planning, it is very difficult to make decisions or to establish a new process. So probably the most important thing that a marketer can do is actually to set out for the next year what they plan to change and how they plan to change it, and the approvals and different personnel that will need to be involved in those changes. And so why bother? What we have found over the past 12 months is marketers actually are able to say that, yes, we can check the box on each of these 6 items. There's an opportunity to improve TV marketing ROI by 30%. And that improvement comes from being able to take what you learned very early into a campaign and apply it for the rest of the campaign. So instead of waiting until the end of the campaign and maybe applying it to next year's campaign, every month throughout the year you'll be learning more and more about what works and what doesn't, and every month your ROI should improve. So with that, I'll dive into a little bit more detail across each of these items. So most upfront buys include standard terms for marketers, which involve some degree of flexibility. What we were surprised to find when speaking to different marketers and really different media owners is that there isn't necessarily, those standards aren't consistent across industries, they're not consistent across networks, they're not consistent across clients. So what we set out to do is really to put a stake in the ground and what would be a reasonable set of clauses that we have heard from our clients that they have achieved, and could be something that other marketers can put that same stake in the ground. So we recommend at least the following level of flexibility throughout the year. So we have yet to find a marketer who has been able to negotiate upfront contracts without locking in their first quarter. From Marketing Evolution's perspective, this is really not a huge problem because that will give us a great opportunity to learn what's working and what's not. By the end of the quarter, certainly we would probably want to be able to make some changes, but this really is a standard kind of contract clause, and we don't believe it's going to change. Where there is a lot of flexibility is in the following 3 quarters. And the typical terms is a 30-day window, essentially, that you need to make the changes before the last 30 days of the quarter with the following cancellation terms. From Q1 and Q2 of the following year, we have found kind of the best case, most flexible marketers to be able to cancel between 25 and 50% of the original contract in those 2 quarters. And in the following quarter, Q3, that 50% should be cancelable. We understand, of course, that there are other considerations beyond just the cancellation fees that need to be considered, as well as kind of the impact on future bargaining. But really the goal here is to have the option to make changes based on those in-campaign performance learnings. The second kind of core tenet for improving flexibility is this idea of not locking yourself into restrictive CPMs. So the goal should be essentially at the end of your campaign, within the campaign, during the campaign, it's not necessarily to cancel media just for the sake of getting out of media. The goal is to put your marketing dollars in the buckets, the media buckets, and the targets that are most efficient. And when we talk about efficiency, media efficiency is really just kind of 3 components. It's media reach, it's essentially the impact or the % of people you convert, and the cost. So a very kind of straightforward media efficiency equation is your target population size, let's say 100 million people, your media reach for television, 70%, the % of people converted by medium exposure, maybe it's 1 or 2%, divided by media spend. And if you multiply that by $1,000, what that gives you is the number of people impacted for every $1,000 you spent on media. So in the case of 50 million people, 60% media reach, a 2% conversion, and $8 million spend, you would be converting 56 people for every $1,000 spent on your television campaign. One of the fundamental questions that a lot of our client marketers come to us with is this trade-off between premium placements and the trade-off in efficiency. There is no hard and fast rule to be able to say that one is always more valuable than the other, but typically, oftentimes, the math favors some of the premium placement. So if we were to go through that same exercise of doubling the spend and doubling the impact, you essentially see that for now, instead of impacting 56 people for every $1,000 spent, you're impacting 75 people for every $1,000 spent. And I would say, for the most part, we find that marketers typically are not achieving very strong ROI when they're buying the cheapest CPMs. We do find very often that those premiums are really worth that investment. That's not a hard and fast rule. That's something that would need to be investigated. But from a pure ROI perspective, typically you're not well served to buy the cheapest CPMs. But for the sake of this conversation, there's really kind of an ulterior benefit of buying that slightly more expensive CPM. And that is what I just described previously. During the campaign, one of the things you're going to learn is which media are resonating against which types of targets. And what you want to be able to do as you learn that is to adjust your media to target those more responsive people. So if at the end of the day you find that there's a subsection of people that are more responsive, you want to shift dollars to those people. And one of the consistent things that we heard from media owners is that media owners will be much more willing to be flexible when you've committed to premium CPMs. What they would be willing to do at that point is much more likely to do a like-for-like swap across targets and programming. So if you find that men are more responsive than women. You could shift media dollars to the media that will have a higher index of men, whether it's by day parts, whether it's by specific programming. Media owners are always much more flexible when you've already essentially allocated dollars from those premium placements. You just want to move from one premium placement to another. What we have also found, though, is that every campaign is going to have a different kind of mix of what's required against a premium placement versus maybe some of those lower cost CPMs. And so the big opportunity off the bat is this idea of tiering your CPM schedule. So even though you might find that in certain campaigns that you might be more efficient to move with just the lower CPM strategy, to leave a little bit of those higher CPM investments in reserve just to have that flexibility to move it around. And this is also a place that over time your tiering will become much more efficient as you begin to learn and you begin to understand which targets are going to be more receptive. So maybe you start with a broader set of tiers, and over time this is something that you begin to narrow in on. The next core checklist item is this idea of developing the capability to change creative allocation rapidly. This is a very similar idea to what I just walked through, but because it's a creative change and not a media change, this really should be a costless change. And the goal here is the ability to put the creative in front of the people who are going to be most likely influenced by. So using a recent example, the 2014 Winter Olympics, most marketers who were entering that execution came in with probably 6 or 8 different executions at least, featuring different athletes, different messages, different products. What we wanted to be able to understand is, as we moved into the actual Olympics from the pre-campaign ceremonies, what should be the appropriate rotation for those different pieces of creative? The traditional way of thinking about creative rotation is through a traditional creative task, the copy task, where you show someone either the creative, you show them the stills, and essentially you ask them, do you like the ad? Do you remember the ad? Do you recall seeing the ad? And a certain percentage will say yes, a certain percentage will say no, and the types of decisions that are typically made, it's very often it'll be a cutoff threshold of saying, all right, this crossed our 70% barrier, let's run this. Or, we've seen that recall has moved up to 12%, let's keep it in rotation. And what we have found is that there's really a much more efficient and impactful way of thinking about creative rotation, which is to say that of that 74% of people who say they like your ad, or the 100% of people who've seen your ad, that's a pretty diverse group of people with different kind of demographics, psychographics, different attitudes about your brand, about the category. And in that group of people, there are going to be people who actually respond much more favorably to different types of creative. So our goal is to find the people who are actually impacted by each ad. So one ad might be more influential against young males. One ad might be more influential against a higher income, higher educated group of people. And it's not so much that one ad is better than the others, although that might be true. What happens much more frequently is that different ads resonate with different types of people. And when we talk about actual performance, we're not talking about did someone say they like your ad. We're talking about based on exposure to your campaign, to that creative message, did they convert? So the conversation then shifts. Instead of let's run it or let's keep it in rotation, let's put the right ads in front of the right people. And the way we do that, as I described, is we essentially match up by psychographic, demographic groups, which ads are working best with which people. We align that impact with the media audience profile. So for each of the networks that you're in, each of the programs you're in, we know what that media audience composition is. So in network 1, maybe it's 80% males, 20% females, and maybe that's reversed for network 2. So then what the final set, actually setting the rotation to match impact with the audience. So for each of your networks, for each of your day parts, we'll essentially recommend what the optimal rotation would be based on the types of people who have responded best to the ads. What we've found is that we take a look back at our clients' Q4 campaigns. So based on actual data, we saw a minimum improvement of 1.5% in terms of incremental ROI, and we saw a maximum improvement of 14% campaign improvement in ROI. And what's so remarkable about this is that it's nearly costless improvement. Really, it's found money. There really isn't typically a significant fee for changing rotation, and something that can be done quickly and easily. So one of the really kind of fundamental takeaways, I hope, from this conversation is the idea that you need to be able to mobilize very quickly to be able to change creative. And that requires coordinating across your agencies as well as your internal teams. And here's the opportunity for upside. The fourth idea is this idea of holding back 15 to 20% of your budget for in-market decisions. And this is a very simple idea, which is by the time that you've actually kind of reached that in-market point in your campaign, you will know what's working and what's not. And you want to be able to add more money to what works best. And that doesn't need to be 6 months into the campaign. That can be 3 weeks into the campaign. That could be 6 weeks into the campaign. But the core difference between that annual budget planning process and 6 weeks later is 6 weeks later, you'll have an idea of what's working and what's not. This is an area where we really strongly recommend you partner very closely with your media agency to understand what the available inventory is going to be, whether it's based on the time of the year. For example, during the electoral cycle, maybe this wouldn't be as good of a strategy. But for 10 months out of the year, we find that there is ample inventory in the scatter market, and you can play through some of those scenarios to say, well, if we had to pay a 10% premium to be able to invest this incremental dollar, would that be worth it based on the media response we're seeing? And for us, probably 75 or 80% of the time, the answer is yes. That the difference between a marketing vehicle that's working really efficiently, a target that's working really efficiently, can be 200 or 300% higher than a marketing vehicle or media vehicle that's not working efficiently. So we have found that kind of best-in-class marketers are withholding about 20% of their budget for those in-market decisions. What's really important as you go through this process is to focus on future campaign impact. Too often, marketers think of marketing ROI as being a static number, that your let's say, your network day part ROI is $2, your sports cable prime is $2.50 or whatever it might be. But the reality is marketing ROI exists on a curve. And as you move up that curve, as you saturate the market with reach and frequency, your efficiency is going to go down. And with that, your ROI is going to go down. So really a critical part of making these in-campaign decisions is not just taking ROI on that curve today. So here in this case, the y-axis is the number of people you're expected to convert at different levels of spend. So in the case of broad cable TV, at $6 million, you're expected to influence 3.6 million people. The idea is to think about where you're going to be at the end of the campaign when you take into account those incremental investments that you're considering. And why this is so important is because if you're not looking forward and thinking about what's going to happen after you add those dollars, is you could actually be adding the dollars inefficiently. So really kind of the critical piece, and not only do you need to withhold the 15 or 20%, you need to be able to plot out these curves to be able to say not only where are we today, where are we going to be in 6 months after the rest of the population has been exposed another 5 or 6 times or whatever it might be. So a core part of all of our engagements is this idea of predicting forward. The fifth tenet is the idea of identifying if local TV is worth the premium. And unlike the other rules where I would say that there is kind of a hard and fast version of the truth that we've seen, this really depends on the marketer and their core targets. The underlying goal here is to be able to take advantage of the greater flexibility of local TV, even if you're a national advertiser. So local TV has a lot of benefits. The two most significant benefits, one is a really short cancellation window. Compared to national TV, compared to certainly the upfront buys, local TV contracts usually contain clauses that allow for cancellation much more kind of right up to the date of actual execution than other buys. And typically, the penalties are also smaller with local television, which provides an opportunity to, again, take the dollars into things that aren't working so well and shift them into places where they are. The other thing that we found pretty consistently is that local television typically offers much greater day-part and flighting flexibility. And I think a lot of this has to do very often with the slightly different dynamics of relationships when you're buying local television. But we have found that, very kind of widely across our clients, local TV buys, the buy is much more accommodating in terms of moving it across day parts or even parts of the year. And why that becomes so important is, of course, every day part is going to have a different audience composition. And once you learn which targets are responding best, you can move into the places where you find the greatest density of those people. And when you talk about even parts of the year, so shifting dollars back later in the year, is that idea of flighting and frequency. So if you think back to that idea of that curve, a lot of what you want to be able to understand is what is the optimal frequency for me to be able to achieve my goals, and how is that going to change throughout the year. So if you learn that your target is becoming saturated after a frequency of, say, 8 or 10, and you have a plan that is going to reach that level of frequency within 2 months, there might be an opportunity to push some of that investment back later in the year to achieve a slightly more kind of even frequency when accounting for decay that is going to be much more efficient. Trade-off, of course, is a cost premium. That local television is completely more expensive, and depending on the market, sometimes much more expensive than national television. So our recommendation here is to start with a simulation, and it really is a what do you need to believe analysis. So one of the types of simulations we've conducted with marketers and their agency partners is going through kind of your key markets. So where are the places on top of your national television that might be worth supplementing with an incremental buy, understanding what are those market rates, and then working through the exercise of how much more effective would that local market TV have to be for it to be worth putting into our plan. And the key to thinking about that is not only how much more effective should it be, but essentially, is it going to be as effective as the some of the more efficient media vehicles that we typically see? Because that is, of course, kind of the key benefit of the local television is it provides that flexibility. So it's not just is it kind of as effective as your average ROI? Is it as effective as some of your more successful ROI numbers across different day parts, targeted programs, et cetera? If that's believable, if the kind of simulation, and for our clients, we'd run that through our impact-based planning software to automate that process. If that's believable, then we'd recommend running a small test in a market, pick a local market, pick a certain kind of time of year, and actually run through it to be able to create that case with actual data to say, was this worth it? Is it worth investing that incremental cost premium to get enhanced flexibility? And I would say in probably 3/4 of our clients, the answer is yes. But for some of our clients who are investing in more expensive media markets, the answer can sometimes be no. And finally, the last rule, and I would call this the golden rule, is to establish a real-time operating rhythm. And the goal here is to just align all the stakeholders, both internally and externally, to facilitate in-market decision-making. So what I did just yesterday is I actually went into one of my colleagues' calendars, grabbed their screen from this week, and I have a feeling that this looks familiar to a lot of people, which is kind of back-to-back meetings all day, every day, throughout the year. One of the things that I can say, having worked with our clients for the past 6 years, is if you're trying to make the process once you've already received the results, it's too late. To be able to really act on the types of in-campaign learnings, to be able to take advantage of the flexibility that we just walked through, you need to be able to create that process at the start of the year and spell it out for the full year. So what does that look like? So when we're working with our clients, there's really kind of 3 stages that I think you could walk through or move through when you think about what that enhanced flexibility. Most of the times when we start working with our clients, they are going through an annual planning cycle, planning once a year, kind of testing to see how it works, looking backwards, and then applying that forward. The first step that we want to do right off the bat, even before we get started working, is moving that to at least a twice-a-year cadence. However, I would say the majority of our clients are in what I would say either kind of this run or sprint stage. Run is adjusting your media and creative quarterly, so making substantial changes to both your creative allocation, but even more importantly to your media plan throughout the year. And for our clients who have been working with us for a little while and have built in kind of the processes to do so, we're actually doing this on a monthly basis. So they're really, in a lot of ways, eliminating the annual planning cycle and having a constant test and learn. So what are the key steps to actually go from walk to run to sprint? So the first thing, the most important thing, is to identify the cancellation dates for your media, whether that's your upfront media that you bought nationally, whether that's the local media that you've bought, really going through and for all of your big media buys, working with your agency and the media owners to understand when do we need to be able to make these decisions by, because those dates are going to be the dates that you really anchor towards. You want to be able to make sure that you have all of the intelligence that you need well before then, so that by the time you reach those dates, you can have already executed your changes. So we'd recommend creating really just a grid, down the first column, listing out all of your key media, and then across the top for each quarter, listing out when are those drop-dead dates. The second piece is to then identify who needs to approve those in-campaign changes. Sometimes it'll be the same group of people who are involved in the annual planning process, but oftentimes it's going to be a much more kind of trimmed down, leaner group of people. That'll typically be the core working group of the folks who are the brand leaders, the marketing leaders, the marketing analytics or insights folks. It'll certainly include your agency partners, and it potentially might even include your marketing leadership team. Then the final piece is once you know who needs to be involved and you know the dates, it's really a matter of working backwards, which is to say, if we need to make our changes by this date, we know the people who are going to need to approve those changes. How long and when should we put those dates on the calendars for getting our data and analytics? And that might just be, even 2 or 3 steps. So what is the findings recommendation review? So if you're working with Marketing Evolution, what you'll likely receive is our findings of which media is working, which is not, which media groups are most efficient, which are not, and then based on that, a lot of the optimizations that we described. And again, if you want to learn a little bit more about our optimization process and our software, I'd recommend taking a look at another one of our webinars, but it's really an automated process. So then the question just becomes approval and implementation. So working backwards, if you start with the cancellation dates, you identify the people who need to be involved in the process, and then you can set up essentially when you need to receive your results before those cancellation dates in order to get the approval and to implement. One of the kind of the temptations that we've seen when working with our clients is this idea that this process should mimic the annual planning process. That process that I described earlier on that I know for a lot of clients can be a 3-month process, a 6-month process. From the day you get your initial results, from the day the changes happen in market, it should be a matter of weeks and not a matter of months. For our clients who've become really efficient at executing these changes, from the day they first see their monthly results until they've made those changes in market, it can be as short as 2 weeks. And that involves kind of a streamlined process. It involves a lot of trust in the data and analytics based on kind of seeing the positive results. But that's the type of timeline you should be working towards. So then to recap, number one, make sure that you have a base level of flexibility in your upfront television buys. Although these will never be totally flexible, and we understand that there's always extenuating circumstances as to why you'd want to hold on to certain buys, give yourself the option to be able to make those changes if you're presented with compelling evidence that it's worth making the change. Number two, don't fall in the trap of restrictive bargain CPMs. Oftentimes we see that the premium investments just on their own provide an incremental ROI, but even more importantly, those CPMs will give you the opportunity to trade into other day parts, other programs that will have the people who have been most efficient in responding to your marketing or media message. Number three is develop that internal capability to change creative allocation. It is very rare in marketing to be able to be presented with kind of free money, found money. Putting the messages that are most efficient in front of the people who are most responsive to those messages really is about as close to found money as you can find in marketing analytics. And that should be a process that you should be able to execute in a matter of days. Four, as you build up this ecosystem and build confidence in the ecosystem, you'll find that there's a positive ROI by holding back budget, whether that's 15% or 20% or even moving that number up as you become more flexible in your campaigns. You will want to be able to put dollars into the media vehicles that are most efficient, particularly if you're seeing a 2 or 3x difference between your top performing media vehicles and your lowest performing media vehicles. Number five is go through both the thought exercise as well as the actual executional exercise of identifying if local TV is worth the premium. Local TV provides an opportunity to be very targeted, to have really enhanced media flexibility, but it comes at a price. Whether that's worth it for your organization will really depend on what you're trying to accomplish, but develop that framework to be able to answer that question. And finally, and most importantly, even if you're doing none of the other things above, is to establish that real-time operating rhythm. The expectation, the norm is going to be that you're going to make changes, and the exception is that you're going to leave things the same. And even if that's starting with just creative rotation and kind of moving up slowly to some of these other items, moving more media dollars, leaving things kind of less rigid throughout the year, unless you establish that operating rhythm at the start of the year, before the end of the year, and really project it out with all of your key stakeholders, you're not going to be able to apply any of the flexibility, and more importantly, not be able to apply the learnings that you've gained throughout the year. So we have about 15 minutes left. What I wanted to do is ask if anyone had any questions. You should be able to actually type your question directly into the webinar box. I'll wait just a moment for those questions to come in, and then I'll answer any questions. So the first question I received was who should be involved essentially in that marketing core team to make those approvals. And one of the things that we briefly talked about is the idea of efficiency. And in order to make this a 2-week process and not a 2 or 3 month process, it really is important to have a kind of efficient core working team. What we have seen as kind of the most effective and efficient core working team, I think number one is a very close collaboration with your media agencies. The media agencies really should be kind of an integral partner and in a lot of ways driving this practice. And it cannot be the type of situation where it's kind of rolled down to them, make these changes. You're going to want to have their very close involvement because they'll be able to help you move through kind of some of the very practical matters of making these changes. So I think it's really important to have the media agency involved, very closely integrated, receiving those results at the same time as everyone else. Two, and this is a relatively recent trend, is that we are seeing more and more of our clients actually build out marketing ROI specialists. So for a long time, we've worked with marketing analytics groups, consumer insights groups, certainly the media teams, the brand strategy and marketing teams, but we're seeing more marketers carve out what is called a marketing ROI specialist to help coordinate the process. That person or those people can play an absolutely instrumental role in quarterbacking this process because they can sit across the different groups to make sure that everyone is participating, making sure all the information is circulated, and being the one who's kind of the impartial third party to say this is working and this isn't. And then I would say certainly representatives across your media teams, your marketing teams, your brand teams, but really a true representative and not the full teams. This is the type of process where you want that core working team to be 4 or 5 people, 5 or 6 people, and not 20 or 30 people. Great. So I'll just pause a moment. If there's any other questions, please feel free to submit them. Well, thank you everyone for taking the time to join this conversation. If you'd like any more information about today's conversation, about Marketing Evolution, please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly. My email address is tim.petrella@marketingevolution.com. Thank you all for joining, and I hope to speak with each of you soon. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.